Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Sarah Dash, President and CEO of the Alliance for Health Policy, and on behalf of our entire staff and board of directors, welcome to today's briefing, From Bench to Body, how the U.S. healthcare system plans to distribute COVID-19 vaccines. For those who are not familiar with the Alliance, we are a nonpartisan resource for the policy community dedicated to advancing knowledge and understanding of health policy issues. I want to thank Arnold Ventures, the Commonwealth Fund, and the National Institute for Healthcare Management Foundation for supporting this event. And remind everybody that you can use join today's conversation on Twitter using the hashtag AllHealthLive and following us at AllHealthPolicy. Please get your questions ready. You have a speech bubble icon in your participant window. And if you send in your questions, they will get collected and we will address as many as we possibly can throughout the broadcast. Today, the Alliance has brought together 3 experts who can lay out in detail the science and the standards behind the safety and efficacy of the novel coronavirus vaccines and how the U.S. healthcare system will distribute them safely. Here with me today to further discuss the science, safety, and uptake of COVID-19 vaccines and what we can expect in the coming days and weeks is a group of esteemed experts. First, I'm thrilled to be joined by Ms. Esther Krofa, Executive Director of Faster Cures, a center of the Milken Institute. Ms. Krofa has deep experience in the government, nonprofit, and private sectors and in vaccine development, and we're thrilled to have her here. Next, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Litjen L.J. Tan, who is Chief Strategy Officer at the Immunization Action Coalition and has years of experience in distributing vaccines to communities and in his work. Finally, we have Hemi Torsen, a visiting senior policy fellow at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, where she also brings with her a wealth of state government experience as well. So we're thrilled to have you all with us. And let me invite you all to just turn on your cameras and let's start with you, Esther. Hello. Fantastic. Glad you are all here. I know it's a very, very busy time. So Esther, let me just start with you. You're such an expert on the evidence of the safety and efficacy of vaccines, and we know that the Pfizer vaccine received an emergency use authorization from the FDA just last week, and that vaccine is starting to be deployed. We're expecting a committee meeting tomorrow to advise on whether there should be an EUA for the Moderna vaccine. Tell us just a little bit about where we are in the process. What are the committees looking for with regard to safety and efficacy? What do we know?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Sarah, for having me. It's a delight to be with you again. Certainly regard very highly the work of the Alliance. So thanks so much for making all of these sessions publicly available to answer these questions. So where are we? Well, first of all, I would just say that we are in a really incredible place when we think about where we've been this year, what we wanted to accomplish in terms of vaccine development. Early on, when we started tracking the development of vaccines and therapeutics in March, we had a handful of candidates. Now have well over 236 different vaccine candidates that are in either preclinical or clinical development, 38 of them that are in human trials, either phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, 8 that are in phase 3. And if you've heard experts all over the last several months, there are predictions about in 12 to 18 months, we'll likely see some vaccine candidates that being at this point in December, that we're now seeing one over the finish line, at least from an authorization perspective, and another one close to finish line, is just absolutely an incredible place to be from a science perspective. So first, I just have to start by applauding all of the scientists that have been working on this and the real heroes, which are the individuals who have enrolled in those clinical trials. So where are we now? We have Pfizer and BioNTech, their partner, that have successfully gotten through in the US an emergency use authorization. We should be clear that this is an emergency use authorization, not licensure for the vaccine. The authorization really allows the FDA the flexibility under the context of a public health declaration or emergency to consider either biologics, therapeutics, and even devices, their use where there are no other known entities, compounds, solutions for a particular pandemic. So we're in that kind of an emergency situation, and the FDA is exercising their ability to be able to use that authority So we have Pfizer again, who has their emergency use authorization. Right now, doses of the Pfizer vaccine are being made available. Moderna similarly submitted to the FDA an application for an emergency use authorization for their vaccine. We have the advisory committee, the VRBPAC committee that FDA puts together that met for the Pfizer vaccine. They're meeting again tomorrow to consider the data for the Moderna vaccine. And this really is to look at the totality of the data that the companies are providing around what they have discovered in terms of safety and efficacy coming out of their phase 3 clinical trials. So what we expect is a real careful application review by that committee in terms of all of those elements, which patients were enrolled, how do they do coming out of their first dose, their second dose, and what do we need to understand in terms of their use for the broader population. What we expect tomorrow is that there's a lot of similarities between the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. So we might have questions as similar to the questions that came up in the prior application around should this be made available to those under age 18 at this point, where there is a lot of debate. But otherwise, we may expect smooth sailing for the Moderna review tomorrow during the committee meeting. The FDA then comes back and reviews that input as well as their own analysis, and then comes forward with their recommendation for emergency use authorization, which we could expect by the end of the week. So again, we're in a really terrific spot for these two vaccines. There are a number of other vaccine candidates that we're hoping to see data likely in the new year.
Great, thank you so much, Esther, and so many follow-up questions. We'll hopefully get to some of these during the discussion. So LJ, I mean, you've been involved in adult immunization communication for a really long time. What are you hearing on the ground? Like, what are people believing, perceiving about the vaccines? What are some of the challenges that you're seeing? How are we going to, and how are we going to address some of those questions?
Yeah, that's a great starting point, Sarah. And again, I want to echo what Esther said. Thank you very much again for this opportunity to rejoin everybody here on another one of these great discussions. So thanks for that. I appreciate that. So I just want to point out the fact that I think, the challenges of vaccine acceptance has not been something that adults have generally had to deal with we hear about, children, pediatric vaccine hesitancy. We hear about, does the vaccine cause autism, so on and so forth. A lot of that concern has been predominantly focused in the pediatric population. It is amazing what we are now hearing and what we've opened up now with regards to COVID-19. I think part of it's a little bit of our own doing. We've now added some hesitancy around COVID-19 vaccination. So what we are hearing is exactly what I think everyone's been hearing around on the panel, is this idea that there is a lot of concern about, did we go too fast? What are the things that have been put into place to assure that this process was transparent and obviously safe, evidence-based, right? So those are the things that I think we've been hearing now. And I think what we're trying to tell people and what we're trying to hopefully help people understand is that this process actually has been, regardless of what you've been hearing about the outgoing administration's efforts and so on and so forth, the process itself has had integrity and has been guided by career scientists, independent scientists at both the FDA and the CDC. And I think this is something that we're trying very hard to help people understand the process. And I think Esther has already said, for example, in an EUA process, the FDA does not have to call their advisory committees to meet. They can issue an EUA without a VRBPAC meeting. They chose to do a VRBPAC meeting. They chose to do 2 of them, and I argue they'll do more. And the idea for that is to show that there is independence in the evidence review here. And I think that's important for all of us to recognize that that's there. And then that being said, I think then the next step, obviously, the ACIP is an evidence-based group that has done a lot of work in looking at the next step, which is what are the side effects, what are the benefits, risk-benefit analysis in terms of a recommendation of whether or not to even give the vaccine to the public. And as you all know, the ACIP voted that the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is recommended for everyone 16 years of age and older. And that is the difference between the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. The Moderna vaccine, the EUA will be 18 years and older, just to put that out there. So I think the ACIP's work, again, a committee of independent scientists, physicians, clinicians, looking at the evidence again. So this is over and beyond what the FDA is doing, right? Again, and they're coming out with a recommendation saying that this vaccine is safe, this vaccine is effective, is efficacious. We need to be giving it out there. So now that that's done, we now roll it over, and we hope that our states can take that and run with it, right? And say, we've got all this evidence now, let's implement. And I think that's where we are.
Great, thank you. And before we move to Hamix, I want to ask you about like how this is being handled at the state and local level. I just want to ask you, LJ and Esther, feel free to chime in. I mean, just, you know, we've heard efficacy rates of, you know, over 90%, 95% rate for both of these vaccines. And I think that was above and beyond what was being hoped for. Can you just briefly comment on that? Like, how was that unexpected to you? Was that a surprise to you? And what does that tell you as well about just the importance of getting the vaccine out there?
I'll start with the evidence, and then Esther, you can jump in with, you know, what does that tell us? I think clearly, I think the 95% effectiveness rate took even the smartest scientists a little bit by surprise. I think the reason it took people by surprise is because we don't actually, you know, while we have a lot of experience with mRNA vaccines as a platform, we've never really not licensed the vaccine using the mRNA platform. So we've not had the, you know, the huge sample population studies that generally follow after a vaccine following licensure. So I think most of us were anticipating, and we also know with adults don't respond to vaccination as well as pediatrics. You know, our immune systems actually are waning. I like to say, you know, after puberty, my immune system downhill from there. You know, so it's one of those things where, you know, we have waning immune systems, and so I think it did take us by surprise, especially since the data in both vaccines, as you've seen from the package that FDA has released, is that effective for 65 and older as well, which is not where we used to seeing high level of efficacy. So that did take us by surprise. Now, remember, these are clinical trials. Clinical trials are conducted in the most positive of situations, right? You know, people have compliance, there's exact timing in terms of when you get your second dose, all of that. And we know that in the real world, there will be some variation. And sometimes in the real world, we lose some of those numbers a little bit. The real world effectiveness numbers may actually drop a little bit, but 95% is amazing. And if you think about what it takes to get us out of this in terms of community immunity, 95% effective vaccine gets us a lot further down the road than a 70% or a 60% effective vaccine. So I think this reflects on the mRNA platform as a very good science platform.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, those comments by LJ were terrific. The only thing I would add is that when FDA released their initial guidance document back in June, and then certainly updated that in October, they set the 50% efficacy bar, which was really meant to be, you know, an average of what we typically see for a flu vaccine. And I don't think anyone anticipated or could predict that we were talking about 94.1 to 95% efficacy. And again, it speaks to the fact that we have not had a commercially licensed mRNA vaccine. We haven't seen this kind of data in 30,000, 44,000 plus individuals. But even FDA was trying to set the bar in a relatively reasonable place, and we have far exceeded even that relative standard.
Great, and we're already getting some great questions in the chat about this and the mRNA platform, so I want to get to those, but first I want to give Hammy a chance to jump in. And Hammy, just from your perspective, obviously there's a lot of, you know, there's some unprecedented science here, some better than expected results. Still lots of concerns and questions, perhaps from some on the public. And then there's just like the plain and simple logistics of like getting the shots into the arms of people. We know the Pfizer vaccine requires extremely cold storage. The Moderna, as I understand, does not require quite as cold. So can you just kind of put that together for us, like from the EUA, and like we've already seen some healthcare workers already beginning to be vaccinated. How is this process working? How is it playing out on the ground? And what's the role of the private sector and then the state and local governments as well in making this work? And Hammy, you're muted.
Happy to comment. Thank you for having me on this great panel. So we here at Duke Margolis have been really talking to states and looking at all of their vaccination plans that they all had to submit back in October, and have continued to try to really update that with, as you know, if any of it's following this, all of the state websites have started to release information to the public. And in talking to the state leaders, you know, this is such an amazing development, but unless we can actually be successful in convincing people to get the vaccine, we will not be where we need to be on this pandemic. And I think, frankly, from my perspective, that is the biggest challenge we are facing right now at the state and local level. So I want to talk about that first, and I want to talk about some of the other issues. So, with respect to the public confidence, we actually were just in a state stakeholder meeting, and they were, really concerned about, well, how is the rollout going to work? How do I know the people that go first, are they okay? I don't really have the information I need. And so, all of us here on this panel, read about all of this all the time, and we're excited and we're in the know, and that is not true for the average person. So, I think there really has to be a concerted effort across the country to talk about this in a way that reaches different types of populations. If you look at the polling, you'll see, women, for example, are more hesitant than men right now across families, and women tend to be the healthcare decision makers. So that's a challenge in and of itself. We've been hearing from some health systems that, they've been trying to vaccinate their healthcare workers, and, they had everyone register. They're rolling out the vaccines as they get them. They've had 35% of their healthcare workers not wanting to get the vaccine. So, and these are healthcare workers, right? So who understand more about the healthcare system than others. Communities of color, when you see some of the polling there, just as one example, there's up to 60% of the Black community that really are concerned about getting the vaccine. And, these are some of the same folks that, we saw earlier in the pandemic. There's 5-to-1 ratios of case rates and mortality. Some of that has gotten better, but not across the country in every place. So that's true with the Latinx populations and Native Americans as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here. We are partnering with an organization called the COVID Collaborative, which is a big group of lots of really amazing folks across different disciplines. And I think, states know how to, and local health departments know how to do vaccines. What's unprecedented about this is the level at which they're going to have to roll out the programs. And so that's why there needs to be partnerships, not just with the federal government, which is critically important, but also with, healthcare providers, with health plans, with communities, and really thinking, frankly, much more creatively about how you can have materials that reach all of those different populations. So one thing I do want to mention is the Ad Council, who we all know for their national campaigns, is rolling out materials as we speak. I think probably by the end of this week or early next week. We're working closely with them as part of the COVID Collaborative, and they're really trying to fill a gap of really getting information out to the public at different levels, so that there can be more of a common understanding of, what Esther and LJ really articulately talked about with respect to safety and efficacy, but also who's going to get it first. And if I have one more minute, I just want to talk about the prioritization first. We hear all on the phone, with healthcare workers, with long-term care facility folks, but not everybody in the public understands that and the bigger picture of how it's going to roll out. Some states have started to put this information on their website so people can start understanding it and having, community groups talk about this, and, physicians and health plans and all these other folks. But we're still waiting for the final ACIP recommendations, which will come on Sunday, which should at least address, phase 1A, the first group of healthcare workers and people in long-term care facilities. Phase 1B and 1C are likely to be folks who are older than 65 and also have, a serious medical condition. And then there is also the essential workers who are not healthcare, who are the most at risk. And I think those are the populations that I think are going to be challenging for different states to figure out how to prioritize, depending on how many vaccines they have in their state and who they're going to decide should go first and how to make those determinations. So lots more to talk about, but I can just stop there for now.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. A lot to talk about here. So let's just go to the trust question a little bit, because we've had some really good questions, and I think one of our chat questions is, how can providers better engage patients and build vaccine confidence, particularly in the Black community, which has been pulled as having the highest rates of skepticism and reluctancy. And of course, it's just so important to acknowledge just the very, very specific, historical traumas that have been inflicted on Black communities, frankly, by the medical system and the Tuskegee experiment and others that have, perhaps engendered some of that mistrust. And so, question one is like, what you know, what is being done, what can be done. You can't just flip a switch and turn on trust, right? What has been done sort of maybe throughout the vaccine development process? Why should people trust the process? And then since the chat question actually asked specifically about what providers can do, Amy, if you could maybe just help us get a little bit underneath, like perhaps, you know, where some of the hesitancy may be coming from, just like from the provider community, and how that can also be overcome.
Yeah, so I'm happy to start. So with respect to, you know, how do we really address this equity issue and really getting trust in the communities? So there have been some states that have made equity sort of front and center of how they're rolling out their vaccination plans, but that isn't apparent across all the states. I think all states will take some steps, but some states are taking more than others. And some of the ways they're doing that is they're actually, some of them are giving community grants, for example, to groups to actually help build messages. A number of states have COVID equity task forces, and they're working with those task forces to make sure that, you know, the people that understand the logistics and, like, you know, how you do sort of it from a health perspective can understand how to then also work with communities and messaging, which is a different skill, and it's sort of a different set of principles to think about. With respect to the healthcare providers, you know, I think it differs in every state and locality, but just anecdotally, we've certainly seen, like, you know, some of the nurses actually have been hesitant to really take the vaccine and be first. You know, I think there's a kind of wait and see. They like to see how others do and then follow up and get the vaccine after there's some experience. And so I think part of the trust factor is having, you know, colleagues and people they work with and people they trust in the community get the vaccine and see that those folks are okay and are really kind of, you know, the heroes and really can feed back that information to make people feel like it's okay to get this. You know, healthcare workers understand why. They know their exposure to COVID, but they are still worried about their safety of themselves and their families. So I think the other piece too is from a public perspective, transparency is going to be key. And that's where the data comes in. So the data systems have to really be working well. And, you know, states have done a lot of work, states and localities, on their immunization systems to make sure they're ready. But, you know, this is quite a big undertaking. And so states have had to add enhancements to their systems, make sure the systems can connect to the federal government. There's still more work to be done on that front. It's not quite all done yet. Esther will remember, you know, healthcare.gov. There's always challenges when you have IT systems that are getting built as things get rolled out. But, you know, we need those to work well because there has to be a feed of information of when there's adverse events, you know, who has gotten the vaccine, you know, what do those demographics look like? Are there adverse events? And make sure there's transparency around all of that so the public can feel like they're in the know and they know how it's going and then who's going to come next.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Esther, and as you're responding, Esther, I'd love to hear, because we have a couple of like pretty related questions in the chat that I just want to name, and you know, maybe you can kind of incorporate them. I mean, they're both basically about tracking what are those longer term implications, and one of them specifically kind of notes, and you know, I don't know if you could speak to the science of this a little bit, but since mRNA vaccines have never been licensed, there's sort of 2 years required before autoimmune events could present. You know, will there be an ability to track that concern, related concerns? And I'm going to save that. There was a part 2 of that question around the placebo control that I'm going to just kind of hold for a second, because we've already given you a mouthful here. So.
Well, let me start with the trust question and then we can get into some of the others. I mean, Amy brought up just really important points. I just want to underscore a couple of things. One is Pfizer and Moderna did a great job of slowing down their enrollment, their clinical trial phase 3 enrollment, so that they could increase their enrollment for African American, Latinx populations. So that in and of itself was just such a terrific effort to show that we're not testing this in populations that have not been disproportionately affected by this disease. And then having the data to show, oh, the efficacy rates that we're seeing across populations also applying to that population, and providing transparency around that, I think is absolutely critical. And Amy hit upon that point of transparency. The other thing that I would say is particularly for those communities, and there's certainly a lot of attention around racial equity and racial injustice, is that what people are looking for is to be partners. provide information in a clear and transparent way. Don't do medical research to us, and don't come into the community to say, you must get this, but rather to say, here's information, this is what's occurring, here's what we know to date, and making them a partner in the decision-making process, not coming in as the only experts and saying, here is what you need, which might not be successful. And of course, tied into that is having the appropriate messengers from communities and organizations that those communities trust. But I do think that we have a tendency to kind of swoop into communities that have not really seen all of the range of medical experts, and then wondering, why are people not listening, or why are they not taking things up? So absolutely critical, but we just needed to make sure that it's all within context. Another part of the challenge is the question of speed. So earlier I was applauding how quickly we got here, but we need to continually explain over and over and over again that we went through the appropriate scientific process, that there were preclinical studies done, animal modeling done, a phase 1 study done with small populations, increasingly bigger populations with phase 2, and a larger population with phase 3. FDA did extend the timeline for a 2-month follow-up following this, the initial data that came in their October guidance, and are putting steps in place to make sure that up to a year, even after the initial vaccines rollout, there's tracking that's happening from a company side with respect to safety over time. There are systems where individuals can opt in, being rolled out by the CDC, to be able to share information in terms of any adverse reactions. And all of this real-time information will allow us to capture very quickly, as we've seen even in some limited cases with some allergic responses, here's something to watch out for, and we really provide that updated guidance. But it's going to have to be this continual process. The third thing that I would just mention, you talked about the mRNA platform has not been rolled out for any commercially available vaccine, though, as LJ mentioned, there are decades and decades of experience working with the platform. One of the key questions is it going to change my DNA? And CDC's made it very clear, as well as scientists, to say, no, it's not altering your DNA. It's essentially creating instructions for your own body to produce an immune response. So that should help settle people's questions in terms of what could the potential long-term effects be? Obviously, we'll gather more information over time, but FDA set the appropriate steps and standards and requirements in place that even the vast majority of adverse events that happen for vaccines typically happen in that 42-day to 60-day window, which is what led to that 2-month follow-up data requirement. So I do think we need to continue these messages, and it can't be a one and done from here until we get up to that herd immunity.
Great, thank you. And just to clarify, you said a 2-month follow-up data requirement, not a 2-year. Is that correct?
The 2-month follow-up data before requesting an emergency use authorization by the FDA, but following that, there is up to a 2-year follow-up period of time.
Got it. And LJ, could you address that too? I mean, you mentioned kind of the real world evidence and how that's all going to work. Talk a little bit about that. Maybe what is the adverse event tracking? I mean, I think we kind of got pretty quick, notification of a couple of individuals in the UK. I mean, like within almost like 24 to 48 hours. So how will people know? I mean, there's already lots of questions in the chat. If somebody has allergies to antibiotics, can they take the vaccine? Like, how are people going to know these kinds of things and what works for them and what doesn't?
I think that. Am I on mute? Can you hear me? Good. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing to keep in mind with those actually three UK cases is that they all three had come in with a previous history of severe allergies, and hence you saw the guidance from the ACIP that people with severe allergies, that means people who are carrying, for example, EpiPens, should be currently deferred from the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. But that being said, I think it is important to point out that in almost 45,000 patients, volunteers, the allergic reactions were minimal. The adverse events that actually have been associated with the vaccination that came out of the clinical trials has actually been quite, I think actually have been, for me, surprisingly lower than I had anticipated. I kind of put them at the same level of, above flu, but slightly below the current 2-dose zoster vaccine, the shingles vaccine. I had expected the reactogenicity to be a little bit worse. So I think actually that's a good thing to kind of remind people, is that this is a reactogenic vaccine, but it's not any worse than some of the vaccines we currently have on the market. And just to remind people that it will hurt. You will get some people, like what, 35–40% actually had some systemic reactions, like a day or two of fever. We need to remind people of that. We need to remind people that this is something that we know happens, then that shows the immune system is working. And then that being said, the CDC and HHS, have put in a remarkable amount of effort to supplement our existing vaccine safety surveillance systems, right? Just to remind everybody again, the US has the best vaccine safety surveillance system in the world. We have things like VAERS, which is like a passive monitoring system, which then feeds data into the vaccine safety data link. Under the vaccine safety, we have a whole bunch of things like CISA, which is a clinical investigation system to look at vaccine, to show causal reactions, to show causality between a vaccination event and a potential adverse event. We've got so many systems already in place. And on top of that, they've added additional surveillance systems for COVID-19. So for example, the most recent one is the app-based system called vSafe, where you're going to be, as a healthcare worker and future vaccinees or who receive COVID-19, you're going to be putting in, if you get a severe reaction, you'll put that in and that will go right into the monitoring database so that people can kind of look and see what's going on with regards to reactions after getting COVID-19 vaccine. So I think I am not worried about our surveillance. I think that is something that we're going to find. If there is something, we will find it. But that being said, the data from the clinical trials have been remarkably reassuring with regards to potential side effects from the vaccine.
Sarah, can I just follow up with for LJ on that? Because thank you for articulating all that. Just from like a practical on the ground perspective of what we're hearing from some of the states. So, I think the vSafe is really helpful. I do think there are some consumers that are really concerned about using it. You have to put your information in, your information is reported, and some of them are just not going to use that. And so I think the question is, what is the backup to that? And, the VAERS system for FDA has never had to deal with the level of vaccinations that are going to happen so quickly. So I think there's a concern about the data feeds. And, I think everyone would love to get access to the state's immunization registry systems, and that's just not going to be possible from a privacy perspective. Health plans would like to get access to that so they know, who amongst their members haven't gotten a second dose, who has had adverse reactions based on the clinical record. And I don't know if that's going to quite be able to happen. And so I do think we need to be creative and practical about how to think about making sure these data systems are all going to flow in the way that we think they should. Because I think there's some limitations just at the moment right now of being able to get all of that in the real time that we need, especially for like governors and their staff to feed it back out to the public and make sure there's transparency.
So, I mean, let me just kind of follow up on that. I mean, is the sort of vaccine follow-up part of the messaging, or should it be, as far as like, it's important to not only get your vaccine, but also to report any adverse events, should you have them, and like to kind of trust it? I mean, how does that get communicated?
Yeah, I think it's up, and it's going to be part of, the materials that I think, providers are going to be using. Some of the health systems have already released the materials and training their, workers to make sure they understand the process. I think where it's going to get more challenging, though, is when we get to those mass vaccination clinics, where you're going to try to get lots and lots of people, in for vaccines. And it will be a less personalized, like it's not your employer telling you, it's not your primary care physician telling you who you trust. And you're going to a site. And so I think, we're not there yet, obviously, because we're still in phase 1A. And so I almost feel like this part is the easier part to keep track of and see who's getting it and who's going to get a second dose. It's once we get to the millions and millions of people that follow that are going to come in different, places to really be able to get access to the vaccine. And as we talked about, the communities of color and some of the essential workers that are most at risk, they may have, multiple part-time jobs. They may be going to, their community to get vaccinated. States are going to, and localities are going to try to have some different types of vaccination sites to encourage them to go. And it could be at a local church. It could be at, different places where they feel like people can trust, where there's not going to be necessarily the system built that's going to be the traditional way we would track a vaccine. So.
Yeah, and I want to get to that 1-dose, 2-dose question too. I mean, so what experience do we have with that? And I'm going to ask you, LJ, first, and then kind of Esther, and then Hammy, just what systems will be in place to make sure that, people do get the dose, and not only get the second dose, but get it on the day they're supposed to get it. Because as I understand it, there are different intervals, even for the Pfizer versus the Moderna vaccine. So, like, how are we going to make sure people get it at, on the day X as opposed to day Z when it's too, and is it too late? So speak to some of that.
Yeah, so the great news, I think, Sarah, this is that the CDC has actually issued a living document. It's the clinical considerations document that accompanied their approval, their recommendation for use of the Pfizer vaccine, and that will continue to be updated. And some of these questions are actually addressed in that. I think it's kind of funny to think about the fact that we have 21 days for Pfizer and 28 days for Moderna, and we think that as soon as it's day 21, the vaccine's no good anymore. That's not true. I mean, it's never been true, right? I mean, that's not the way vaccines work. And so I think providing some reassurance around some of these clinical issues is important, and I think they're out there. CDC is doing a good job trying to get that out there. So I'm not that concerned about that part. I think there are systems in place. Hemi has already touched on them, from using the immunization information systems, or some of you might know them as registries, right? And many of these systems have already been developed to be able to do reminder recall, to do provider prompts, to get patients back in for multiple doses. The challenge, and I think Hemi can talk to this, is the fact that we were getting there, and then the pandemic hit, and our immunization information systems are not robust enough yet to do that for every state, and each state's going to be different. So that's one of the things. So there's a little bit of nitty-gritty there that needs to be considered in terms of just getting providers onboarded, right? So that they're actually in the system and can report, and so on and so forth. But that being said, it's not that we don't have experience with this. I mean, we've done multiple dose vaccines before, especially in the pediatric population. And now, thank goodness, we've actually about 2 years of experience now in the adult population with the shingles vaccine that was released in 2018. The data before the pandemic hit was that we were getting about 81% of people back for their second doses, which for the shingles vaccine. Now, granted, it's not exactly the same time frame. The time frame for the shingles vaccine is 2 to 6 months, and so that's a bit longer than the 21, 28 days we were talking about. But I would actually argue that it's probably going to be easier to get people back 21, 28 than actually 2 to 6 months. But that's just me speculating. But the actual data is 81%, and so I think I thought that was actually pretty good. We need to do better, especially with the COVID vaccine. But that tells me that some of the systems that we have in place are working. We just need to make sure that with the immenseness of the capacity that we're now asking them to do, we have the resources at the state level to get them doing what we know they can do. And I think that's the big thing.
Yeah, and I want to ask you, since you mentioned kind of older adults, and we had a couple of audience questions, so I want to try to keep getting to those audience questions, and this kind of goes somewhat back to the communication, but LJ, especially, given you've worked, on the shingles vaccine and for older adults, can area agencies on aging play a role? Like, who are some trusted messengers in the older population? And are there special health equity considerations in the older population? And does Medicare, frankly, like, does having Medicare make it easier, or like, how is that going to work for those older adults who are, at higher risk for complications from COVID?
I'm just going to do a quick one and jump, because there's so much expertise here with Esther and Hemi. So I will say Medicare is actually a great equalizer. I think it especially since it's going to be paying. And I think that's going to help a lot of providers, for 65 and to the 65 and older population get engaged. So I think that's huge. But that being said, I think we need to engage our advocates for those over 65 better. I think we need to engage not just the provider side, which are groups like the Gerontological Society of America, but we also think about AARP, people who have the ears of those over 65. And then ultimately, I remind myself, when we hear about long-term care facilities, that also means engaging the families of residents, because families play a huge role in getting the residents in long-term care facilities, which is our phase 1A population, that we need to engage as well. So I think that's where I would target initial efforts. But Medicare is a big deal. I think the fact that they're paying for this is going to really help. And I'm going to just, defer to the expertise that's around me right now.
Thank you. Esther, you were nodding.
Well,
What
I
would you
just
add?
wanted to chime into the earlier conversation around how do people know to come back for that second dose. And then part of the kits that are being distributed through Operation Warp Speed include a vaccination card. So for those who probably grew up outside of the US, we're probably accustomed to these vaccination cards that you carry that shows what your vaccination schedule has been. So that will be helpful. Of course, it's paper, it's not digital. So we'll have to figure out how it can be integrated within electronic health records and the like. What I actually worry about are the 29 million people who are uninsured and are not part of a physician practice office or any kind of sort of formal healthcare system in terms of them knowing where to go, getting their first shot, and then coming back for their second shot, as well as a homeless and transient population. So when we talk about, the people who are suffering and bearing the worst brunt of the disease are actually the people who are the hardest to track in our formal systems. And we can't lose sight of that, because what we can end up doing is really having an inverse response, that those who probably are lower risk outside of the 1A group are getting access to the vaccine, and those who really need the vaccine, we're not working in a creative way to get access to the vaccine. So we have to think about really carefully, mobile units and having community health workers and others deployed, which I'm sure Amy will speak to. That's resources that states need to educate that whole, that workforce and getting them equipped for all of this. I think to the question about, the older adult population, there's a lot of, I think platforms that are already established, vehicles to get to that older population. So I'm actually quite encouraged to think about how we can get there. The scale of this is enormous. I mean, LJ talked about, well, we have experience through Zostavax. That's the smaller population. We're talking about trying to vaccinate a huge majority of the country. And we've never tackled anything at this scale before. So I do think we need to be humble in terms of our approach and maybe add on an X factor of what we don't know. So there is going to be a lot of learning, and integrating that learning in real time, coupled with the resources, appropriate resources for state and localities, will be quite important.
Great, thank you so much. Well, speaking of the scale of this, we have a few questions in the chat around kind of numbers of doses, distribution. So I'd like to sort of turn to some of those series of questions. First, and maybe this question was directed to you, Esther, so we'll put you on the spot at first, and then others can chime in. Can you shed a little bit more light, or some light on what is happening in terms of the administration's ongoing talks with Pfizer to purchase additional doses? Like how, is it going to slow down vaccine distribution? Do we have enough doses? Should there be an invocation of the Defense Production Act, or are there other steps that need to be taken just to ensure that we have adequate numbers of vaccines? So put you on the spot with that question as far as the scale, and then I want to get to the timing of the distribution.
Yeah, I mean, those are fantastic questions. I think we're seeing a lot of news reports related to that. Operation Warp Speed's goal was to have contracted 300 million doses of a COVID-19 vaccine by the end of the year. They secured 100 million doses from Moderna, 100 million doses from Pfizer, and have contracts in place for AstraZeneca, Novavax, and the list goes on with the 6 vaccines that they had identified. The question, of course, right now is knowing that the Pfizer vaccine is as efficacious as it is, how can we scale the delivery even beyond that 100 million doses? Operation Warp Speed did not contribute to Pfizer's development of the vaccine. I think that's important to note because they don't have visibility into the manufacturing, the supply chain, the raw materials, procurement, and so forth. So the discussions right now are how can the government, U.S. government, help Pfizer where there might be some challenges or roadblocks of securing some material so that they can scale their ability, including manufacturing, to scale their ability to deliver more doses. Because Operation Warp Speed did not contribute to the development and their contract was for 100 million doses plus the option for 500 million doses, Pfizer had the option to contract out with other governments. So they have contracts in place to deliver doses to the UK, to Brazil, other places in the world. And so there's this question around, are others a little bit ahead of where we could be? But again, it's important to think about what Operation Warp Speed's plan was, which is a full portfolio approach, right? Not putting all the eggs in one basket. When these contracts were secured back in June, July, we did not have insight that these are going to be 95% efficacious, vaccines or the safety. So you have to be able to spread that risk. And so is it appropriate for them to do that? Now is an appropriate time to try to make sure that we're addressing any of those supply chain issues, if they are issues, to make sure that we're getting additional doses coming out of Pfizer. Also important to note that we have Moderna as well, where Operation Warp Speed did contribute to the clinical development and worked very closely with NIH in terms of even ongoing clinical trials starting at phase 1. So there is line of sight into all of the different manufacturing capacities to be able to scale the number of doses that are coming out of Moderna. Of course, there's 100 million, and then the options for more additional doses as well. 2.9 million doses have already been shipped out. That's what's being distributed now. We're getting the news of it's being in use in different places. Another 2 million is expected by next week. We're just going to continue to see more doses available as we get through the end of December into January, February, but it will be ramping up over a period of time.
Great. And I want to follow up on this because I actually kind of want to note and ask if you agree. I mean, it seems to me pretty remarkable that we have this number of doses already. And, I think earlier in the summer and the spring when we were talking about vaccine development, one of the key points that was made was that part of the way that the timeline was accelerated was not by cutting corners on the science, but in fact, it was by sort of parallel processing some of the supply chain, procurement, some of the manufacturing, and that in fact that the companies actually manufactured a lot of these doses at risk, kind of knowing that if the results weren't so good, they would kind of throw those out. But if the results were good, they'd be like ready to go. So I wonder if you can comment a little bit on that. And, I know earlier in the pandemic, there were supply chain, concerns as well. Like just, maybe what has gone well from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that at-risk strategy has gone well. That's why we are able to see within 24 hours of an EUA doses being shipped out. And, I'd love to get LJ to comment on this as well. But that did work, which never really is the strategy if you are a commercial product sponsors. You're going to put your business, portfolio and on the line by manufacturing 100 million doses of a vaccine that has not made its way through phase 3 clinical trials. That's unheard of. And so what we determined as a country and many others around the world, including CEPI, for example, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, also committed to this strategy, which is we are seeing the devastating impact on human lives. We're seeing the devastating impact in terms of the economy. When we weighed that cost benefit analysis and say, if we put $500 million up for advanced manufacturing, what does that compare to all of these other ripple effects that we're seeing, losing $1 trillion a month in terms of the economic effect? That made sense. We never really have this kind of a government-sponsored approach to vaccine development. That is why we've seen the process go much more quickly. And we'll see that in some cases, we do get some vaccines over the finish line. In other cases, we don't. And we made that investment and we decided that was the right approach, but it would not otherwise be commercially feasible.
And I know we could talk for hours about the business model of vaccines, and maybe we'll have a panel on that next year. But maybe this will be an approach that's used in the future. I don't know.
Well, I mean, just really quickly, that is, yeah. I mean, that's a novel approach to think about, particularly where there are not incentives for infectious diseases. I mean, that was the challenge for a number of these companies, which is right now we're in the middle of a pandemic. There's a lot of attention, a lot of dollars. We tend to forget and go back to life as normal. And these companies don't have a commercial incentive to continue developing platforms for potentially pandemic pathogens, right? So we do need to think about that and make that another panel.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, May, I want to turn to you, and we've now talked about phase 1A and phase 1B, and then there's some issues around like who is an essential worker and is it teachers, and will there be vaccine mandates? I just first let me just kind of ask you a level setting question. I mean, what is the timing? Like how far away are we from as it stands now, from kind of the more general public getting the shot, as opposed to, obviously the critical populations that we're talking about right now in the earlier phases?
Yeah, maybe just breaking it down, but with just some estimates of population numbers would help. So, Esther, I think, so eloquently talked about how we got to the 200 million vaccines currently that the federal government has purchased, which is fantastic. But just to give you a sense, in phase 1A, there's estimates that, the healthcare personnel is 21 million. And I should say of that 200 million, it's really only 100 million people because they have to get 2 doses. So we have 100 million covered right now and more to come, but just that's what we're working with. So healthcare personnel is around 21 million, long-term care facility residents is around 3 million. When you get to the essential workers, if like the bigger bucket that's not healthcare, that's upwards of 87 million across the country. And then when you get to the adults with high-risk medical conditions that are over 65 years of age combined, it's potentially up to 150 million combined, 100 million with just the adults, and then the above 65 is another 50 million. So, just adding that up quickly, you're around 261 million plus for just phase 1. So, I think there's a lot of factors of how many more doses will, the federal government be able to procure. They've really done a fantastic job, I think, of doing what they've done so quickly. How many more vaccines and how quickly are they going to be getting an EUA? Time will tell on that, hopefully fairly soon. But these are all factors to know, like how quickly you're going to be able to get to the later phases, phase 2, phase 3, and then the general population in phase 4. I think, anecdotally, a number of experts have said, and I'd be curious about Esther and LJ's comments, it's really going to be like summer before we really see the vast majority of the country being vaccinated. The other piece too is the vaccine hesitancy piece and how effective are we going to be on the messaging. I think the hope is that we're going to do all the things we need to do and get the message out, and people will see that it's okay and it's so important to get it. And then, we'll be able to catch up on those that may not initially want to get the vaccine. But it's all about the supply and the rollout to know where we're going to be. The other thing I just have to say, because I feel like I need to comment on this in every one of these talks, is also educating the public that, the vaccine is in incredible development, but it's not going to solve everything in the next month. We are in the longer haul with our face masks and our physical distancing and our, avoiding crowds and all of these other measures that we're still doing, because, I just did a whole thing on healthcare capacity, and California is in the lead now, but I mean, in some of their places, in some of their counties, they're at almost 0% ICU capacity. We are really in the midst of the third surge, and so we can't let our guard down with respect to all of the other things we need to do. The vaccine is an incredible development, but it's going to take time before we really can stop all of these other pieces.
Yeah, we got to get through it in order to get out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think
hard. People are tired. People are tired. So yeah, I know I am.
Exactly. No, it's true in terms of that messaging. I know we're all exhausted and I think we're some of the lucky ones that get to work from home and that kind of thing. And I wonder just, again, in terms of public health messaging, like, let's say, okay, the vaccine does start to get rolled out. What's the threshold by which we can all kind of feel a little safer going out in public? What is are we going to still have to wear masks and social distancing? I think everyone's wondering that, right? Like, how long is that going to last? And do we know the answer to that yet?
So the gold standard, how we measure that, obviously, as everyone here on, is when do we achieve some kind of community immunity, right? I mean, and that's the $100 million question, because if we can have community immunity, we will stop transmission. But there are caveats with all of that. So I think if you may have heard, Dr. Fauci has already said that he's thinking that maybe we'll get there by May. And the reason he's thinking that is because of some of the numbers Hemi has just talked about. Because if we get through phase 1C with enough capacity for vaccines, and that's another thing, do we have enough vaccines? We will have essentially vaccinated 2/3 to 3/4 of the US population. I mean, so that's pretty darn close. If you take into account already infected population, let's say we have a 10% seroconversion rate, and I know there's a seroconversion study that CDC is actually doing to see exactly how many people might have converted, right? So let's say we have 10% seroconverted, and if you take a 95% effective vaccine and R naught, which is how infectious the virus is, of let's say 3, you're looking at having to get about 70 to 75% of the population vaccinated. So that means 65 if you think 10% is already infected. So I think we can get there. I think we can really get there. So that's why it's so important to think about how do we get people assured to get vaccinated, because that is the way that we are going to have to get out of this.
Yeah, and
there is no alternative there.
Thank you. And we've had a number of questions come in about vaccine mandates, and I know that's kind of generally a very controversial topic, but maybe LJ, just to follow on that, I mean, do you think that schools, employers are going to mandate the vaccine? Is it going to be necessary? Like, what are your thoughts?
I'm going to defer to others too on this one, because this is an evolving process. Clearly, I think all of us would rather make, especially since this is still an adult vaccine. It's not, and I don't see a pediatric indication for this for a while. So we're looking at an adult vaccine, maybe down to 16 years of age for the Pfizer vaccine, and in the adult U.S. population, other than the healthcare population for flu, we do not do well with mandates. It's not something it's just something that we're not used to using. And for example, in all other employer settings, we do not use mandates. And even with flu, where we have an incredible track record of vaccine safety, there's still a lot of resistance with regards to a mandate for influenza vaccination. I think one of the challenges, and I know a lot of my colleagues who are ethicists will disagree with me on this. One of the challenges, obviously, with the COVID-19 vaccine is that we're not yet there with a lot of the long-term data with regards to this vaccine. And so the question then is, can you ethically make a condition of employment for COVID-19 vaccine in the absence of some long-term data with regards to safety? So I think, and efficacy, absolutely, right? So I think that's a starting point for conversation. And I think so the hope is that what we will understand as the whole world gets vaccinated is that we'll continue to survey, we'll see data on this vaccine continue to come in, and that people will get vaccinated because of its benefit to themselves and also to their community, and that mandates will not be something that we have to consider. But again, I would love to hear what Esther and Hemi have to say.
Yeah, I know we're short on time, so I'll just say it really quickly, which is that we're talking about emergency use authorized vaccines, not licensed vaccines, right? So flu vaccines are licensed, and others, if you go through the pediatric schedule, and some of the adult vaccines are licensed. We're still in the middle of a emergency use context, so that we have to keep that in mind. I think it's premature for us to talk about mandates under EUAs where additional data is coming in real time as we're seeing experience beyond the clinical trial population. So I think everyone just needs to take a breath and just slow down in terms of where we realistically are. That being said, what we've seen even in the context of testing, for example, is that countries are creating, whether they're immunity passports or testing passports, to say you can travel from place A to place B if you can show a negative, COVID-19 test. We can imagine a scenario where you can show your vaccine card proof, and it allows you maybe to travel between jurisdictions nationally and internationally in a different way. But I think it's a little premature for vaccine mandates.
I also think the certificates may be a little premature too, because we don't have a lot of the science on the vaccine's ability to stop carriage. So I think that's something I would fully expect it's going to, based on the rigorous immune response it promotes. But I think carriage remains still something we need to validate, and they're working on it.
Hemi, we'll give you the last word here. Given that we are short on time, unfortunately, what are your thoughts
on this question, or more broadly on the
well, let me ask you a fairer question. Yeah, and I do want to. Okay. Yeah, LJ, great point that, like, even if you get the vaccine, in other words, what you're saying is we still don't know whether someone might be able to actually still be an asymptomatic carrier. We won't know that. Well, Hemi, let me ask you just sort of as a quick final question. I just want to go back to something that Esther said earlier around the uninsured, the homeless, the very, very most vulnerable populations, and how are states and localities preparing for that, addressing that? What are some of the things on the horizon there?
Yeah, and a number of the states have been concerned about that population. There's one state, there could be more, that actually have included prison populations and homeless populations in the phase 1A priority group, which is Massachusetts. So, I think there's a concern about that. I do think that there was an interest in trying to get to those populations first with respect to homeless and people in prison. The uninsured, I think, is more challenging. I think that's where we really have to, I really was totally in sync with Esther's comments on this. I think that's where, you know, we are going to leave people behind if we are not very focused on how we reach those populations. And that gets back to kind of what we talked about earlier with respect to like, where are you going to be able to give people access? There has to be, you know, free vaccination sites that are accessible to those folks that they feel are safe places to go. And you have to be really targeted in your outreach to them so they are hearing about this and understand why it's a safe place. And, you know, those folks may or may not want to, you know, register themselves with Be Safe, right? If they don't have insurance, or, you know, perhaps they're undocumented. I mean, there could be other reasons why they may not want to disclose a lot of information to the government. And so how do we reach those populations is going to be, I think, the biggest challenge. I also just want to say that in terms of all of us, you know, working together, you know, on this panel and beyond, it's a huge partnership. And I think, you know, from the national federal government perspective, all the way down to like the people in barbershops and, you know, hairdressers and churches. And, you know, there really, I think, has to be a concerted effort across the entire system to get people information. Because some of the people that we want to reach, especially the uninsured, aren't going to be reading what you and I read, you know, in the news, et cetera.
Exactly. Well, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative, and in this kind of season of hope, ask each of you to kind of end very quickly on like, what is a note of hope for you in all of this process? And if you could articulate that in kind of just a sentence or two, that would be amazing. So LJ, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Amy and then Esther.
So I think the season of hope message I can give, and I think I hopefully haven't stolen Esther's fire in this one, is I think the research and development process that we put through to get this vaccine into arms, right, was remarkable. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from this in terms of getting pharmaceutical products, biologics for rare diseases and other conditions out there in the same way. I'm not saying, and I know this can be like really hard for some people, I'm not saying that we want to bypass clinical trials, but the clinical trial process, as good as it is a huge, long process, especially when we are leaving people behind because of their conditions being rare disease or otherwise, right? And I think we've learned something from this process with the R&D with this vaccine that maybe we can adapt over post-pandemic to a lot of to future drug as well as biologics approval processes. So that's my hope that will happen, and I hope the FDA is listening.
Thanks. Amy, what do you think?
I think that in some ways this pandemic has brought a lot of groups together that never talk to one another. And, you know, my hope is we have this amazing development of vaccine, and you just see so many different types of people donating their time and wanting to get involved and really being a part of, really trying to be part of the solution. And so I hope with those many partnerships that have been, you know, slowly building over this COVID response can really help us get over the finish line with respect to getting vaccines into the arms of millions. So
thank you. Esther.
And I agree with the two, and LJ +1 for what you just articulated as well in partnerships, Amy. I will just say, which is sort of an inverse hope, is the attention that's been placed on systemic racism and racial inequality and social justice in this country. And of course, it's coming out of tragedy, right? It's coming out of a complete devastation for certain communities. But I think we've captured everyone's attention that this is a core area that we need to address in an ongoing way, in a sustained effort over the next however many years it takes us to raise the level of the quality of care for all populations. So that gives me hope.
+1,
Thank
Esther.
you so much. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Conversations that need to be had that have been needed for a long, long time are finally happening. I think that is really hopeful. Well, thank you all very, very much for your just this amazing conversation. I go back to my my 6th grade teacher who taught me the word scintillating, you know, because he liked to teach us words, and this has been a scintillating conversation indeed, just really enlightening. Thank you very much. To our Alliance audience, thank you for joining us in what has been the final Alliance webinar for this year of 2020. We hope you will join us again in the new year. Keep us posted on your thoughts at allhealthpolicy.org and fill out the evaluation that you'll receive. To Esther Krofa, LJ Tan, and Hemi Torson, thank you so much for the amazing work you're doing, and have a wonderful holiday and new year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this
Bye.
wonderful opportunity, Sarah. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.